Thanks everybody for developing the South Carolina Blockchain Initiative. It's a start. There's a lot of programs and things that we're trying to do. But what we don't have is, again, codification of things. Number one, academia, DOD, we need to introduce these strategic plans. I know that South Carolina and now with Congresswoman Mace, they're doing a lot of efforts in this. They're one of the first 4 states that are getting down the road in this, right? We need to increase investments in blockchain research and development because there's so much stuff. You guys are just, I don't know if you're a Bitcoin fan or a blockchain fan or whatever the case is. There's so much more stuff that we've got to do in research and development. And then how about develop a blockchain center of excellence? You guys have not heard of that. No one talks blockchain unless you're part of this community. But what's the government doing in blockchain, right? They don't even have plans for quantum computing yet, let alone what blockchain is. And I would argue that blockchain is not new, utilizing it. Bitcoin has been around, what, since 2010? So it's not new, but it's new to everybody else, right? And that's the big deal. And then develop blockchain academic programs and curriculum. More specifically, there's very few programs that teach people anything about this stuff. You either YouTube the hell out of it, or you're just a passion, you have a passion for it and you watch movies. That's how we all have taught ourselves. We watch the YouTube videos, right? And then lastly, how about creating and establishing a blockchain career track, work roles, right? How do you find a blockchain developer today? Google it? Say again? Exactly, right? So that's pretty much what we need to do as a community in here and infect and kind of inculcate blockchain to everybody else. Because again, it's not new. It's 12 years old at least that we had the proof of work or proof of concept that Satoshi wrote in those different papers that they wrote, the white papers, et cetera. Bottom line is blockchain enables new capabilities by offering that layer of trust that DoD can apply to improve procurement, supply chain, et cetera. And I know I'm going really fast because I want to give the guys time. And somebody asked me this yesterday, so I added this last slide. Okay, so what's the so what with quantum and blockchain, right? Well, the so what is, if you look at quantum as an emerging technology as well, people are already developing quantum-resistant ciphers that could basically secure legacy systems against the threat of quantum because it's just a mathematical problem. And I'll defer to Doc for more specifics, but essentially, if I know that folks are trying to attack my stuff and decrypt everything because the proof of crypto is the word cryptography, then as long as we're staying ahead of the game mathematically, we can always stay ahead of people doing brute force attacks that break the encryption that could steal all your data. Does that make sense to everybody? So, and then here's a couple projects that exist right now. Quantum key cryptography, I'll let you guys read that. Then there's the quantum resistant ledger. It's a post-quantum secure blockchain featuring a signature scheme and unparalleled security. So what quantum brings blockchain is additional security capability. That's the bottom line, right? So let's embrace quantum and let's embrace blockchain because that's essentially what blockchain and quantum does. It increases security where we don't have before. So that's kind of the intent. And then I'll stop there, but Bitcoin post-quantum, it claims to use hash-based stateful extended Merkle signature schemes to secure itself against quantum computing attacks. So this is just to inform you guys that the end of the world is not going to happen when quantum starts. It's actually going to be a good thing for us. I'll pause there for any questions and then defer it to the rest of the staff on what they want to address.
Awesome. Hey, well, thanks for that. Truly appreciate it.
Yep.
It was great. Yeah, I'd really like to talk a little bit more about DoD and kind of what they're doing with blockchain. A great overview. So one of the first examples we saw in blockchain with government is what's utilized as called the SBIR as a contract, so Small Business Innovative Research. And actually one of the first contracts we saw was about a year ago with Simba Chain, where they actually brought in tokenized budgeting and accounting and some of the materials and supply chains they have with the Air Force. So really exciting to see that the DoD is starting to get into this field. Another thing that the Air Force, I think the Air Force has really taken lead on this innovation aspect of it. So we actually at HUMBL have an opportunity at the Air Force where we're actually tokenizing or putting on blockchain the flight cards. So very exciting where right now when an Air Force person goes and they have their flight card data, they go input in an email, well, we're coming up with a wallet for them to be able to input this data into their wallet and put it on chain to kind of help them track the process and the life cycle of the maintenance of these aircraft. So really excited to see the Air Force take lead on that. Clem, there's also an opportunity, I know that was recently announced that there's some blockchain going on. So very exciting to see DoD really take efforts in this. And more importantly, I think we're really excited about the state level. So aside from national security and at the DoD level, even at the state level. So just recently this week, we worked with Senator Bob Hertzberg, who just got approved the first bill to use vital records on blockchain. So medical certificates, birth certificates, death certificates, any vital record can now go on chain in the state of California, approved by the legislature. So very exciting to see that and see California and the Air Force kind of take lead on that. So with that, I'll leave it off to Clem. If Clem, there's something you want to add, and we can go back and forth on some stuff.
So it's interesting enough. So Eric and I were both in the military for a period of time. Definitely not as old as him, but no, I'm kidding. No, but we actually worked in very similar fields. And one of the more interesting pieces is Eric was definitely more in the technical side, and I was more in the plans and operations side. So there was a level of trust where I would put in a requirement. I'd articulate my needs, what the effects are, and what we were attempt to do, and then I would transmit that over in a form or through an equips type piece, and or EREC, I'm sorry, an EREC, and they would get that. And so the one thing that the military is very astute to is process, and breaking things down to the molecular level, so that the most common individual can come in with the least amount of education and training and to do something pretty much sufficiently. And then you get better and better and better. So you start out with a fly swatter, and then you get a bat, and then you get a razor, and it becomes more surgical from there. But one of the interesting things about blockchain is and Eric alluded to this earlier, was there's no strategy. So coming from an ops and plan, so I actually worked at the national level in strategic plans and operations and such, and we have a lot of tools, and I wrote it down because we have a ton of tools that are out there. And when you look at the R&D budgets at the national level, whether it be Department of Homeland Security, DOD, FBI, DOJ, and the only thing that they have with blockchain is in their R&D budgets, their research, development, test, and evaluation. And there's nothing in their operations and maintenance. We haven't crossed that threshold of moving it into a sustainable line of effort where we're going to benefit as a nation from a secure perspective, and that our partner nations are going to also benefit, because national security is not just here in the US, it's the rings that we have around us with partners and how we interact, and the trust they have in us in data management, as well as being able to identify where we might have gone wrong. And what I've learned from both the Alfonsos here over the past few years is, there is a significant level of trust that the blockchain provides, but how we articulate that in the most simplistic form is not what we hear. We all speak slang when we come to conferences, and I found in the DoD as a planner, when somebody would come and say, I want to do, they would call it a bold flanking maneuver, and you're like, that's not what, oh my gosh, it's called an envelopment, and there's a definition for it. And the reason we use these very specific terms is it's common to all. So as we look at these things, and we make the sexy terms, and we do this crazy, glitter stuff, what is it enabling us to do, and what do we expect to get to? Okay, and I tell people, no matter where I am, what does the perfect world look like? And then back off from there, because you can use a chain and all the enabling pieces, whether it be a digital wallet, whether it be hybrid approaches. We're using Web 1, 2, 3. All of those things, you have to have a reason, a recipe to get to the success, but you can't do that if you're speaking different terms. And we speak a lot of different terms across the world, and it doesn't help us when we're also speaking different languages. So that having that common approach is very important. And I would say, hey, I need this effect. I don't need to know how he does it. I just need to know what he's going to do to help me get my job done. And having that trust between the two, because of the common language, is significant. And I think that having the tools that we have today from the national security perspective at the lowest level, meaning the county municipality piece, like in Santa Cruz, if you build trust at the local level, you're going to have trust at the national level, because counties will talk to counties faster than states will talk to counties and them argue like older brother, younger brother, pieces. And so that was exciting to see what Santa Cruz, and they're excited, we're excited. But it's about building that trust through lots of circling and sniffing. What are you going to do? And now they're like, yep, we can do this. So, both the Alfonsos, they can speak to it, because I really do believe in the municipality being the initial secure environment that then spreads to become more of a national security secure environment for all. So I'll hand it over to the senior.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see some of the developments that have come into play. I know that since 2020, there's been a lot of initiatives for distributed ledger technology, and sometimes we don't see or think that the government's looking at blockchain. They are. They're just referring to it as distributed ledger technologies. And what's really cool is if we look at one of the very first initiatives that came out was actually DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and they were looking at taking the green card and turning it into a digital asset using blockchain. So they're looking at digital wallets issuing a verifiable credential that's backed by blockchain to ensure that people aren't fraudulently creating these cards. If you have a permanent resident card and you lose your wallet, which happens all the time, they can what's called revoke that asset immediately, and they can issue you a new one. So what it does is it makes the process a lot easier. We hear a lot about supply chain, and supply chain is really important. And at HUMBL, we're looking at something that brings supply chain use cases to life for DoD. Why? Because having all the information publicly available is great, but there's also risk factors there. So we need a hybrid environment where you can kind of mask certain information. An example of this, let's say that there are food deliveries on supply chain. And normally this military base has chicken coming in all the time. And now they have steaks coming in. Well, now somebody can see on the blockchain, oh, there must be a high-profile person coming in. So that's why they're preparing for this. So a hybrid environment enables governments to be able to have certain information be private, some information be public, and it brings us back to national security. Alfonso is RP, registered practitioner for CMMC compliance, which brings a lot of security levels into this. And if you can talk a little bit about CMMC compliance, NIST compliance, and STIGs, it would be really cool so that people can kind of understand how government's adopting this and why it might seem that they're a little slower to transition to it, but it's in play right now.
Absolutely, and I know, Eric, we had fun talking about this last. So it's really interesting. So the government just came out with CMMC, well, in collaboration with industry, which is based off the NIST 800-171 security controls to ensure contractors are compliant when it comes to FCI, whenever it comes to any CUI, controlled and classified information. And I can really see the blockchain coming in and really assisting with that. So really, tracking who opens the CUI information, who's moving it around, and stuff like that. So when it comes to government, though, we really don't have any STIGs right now, security technical implementation guidelines for any blockchain use cases. So I can really see DISA coming on board and creating some.
And again, everything in the military needs a security classification guide to dictate the sharing of that information. So those are some of the obstacles DoD faces all the time. But to their point earlier, is there's still not a lot of standards, whether it's quantum resistant ciphers or even integrating blockchain. And to why do that? I mean, companies don't even want to do cybersecurity fundamentally, right? But they have to. And so these kind of standards or lack thereof is where we need to inform and influence, right? Because if you're just doing stuff to do stuff, which is what a lot of us do, you're never going to get to the actual bottom of the problem. And at the end of the day, like I brought up initially, China and Russia are really going to town on this technology stuff, and we're still behind them. And so that's the key takeaway is what are we going to do to stay ahead of them? Or how are we going to catch up? I did my master's thesis on the implications of China achieving quantum supremacy first, and after 2012, China stopped patenting anything and writing research about quantum communications and quantum computing and quantum sensing. So either they stopped doing something or they went underground. You guys make the assessment on that. But those are the key takeaways. So we don't know what they don't know. So we're going to open it up for questions for anybody. Clem, you got something?
Actually, about 2012, we started the Office of Commercial Economic Analysis at the Pentagon, and that's actually when they went on the ground because we actually gave them access to all of our pre-patent material through, I guess at the higher levels, they thought that would be cool. So they just, instead of having to steal it, they just got pre-access to it, copied it, and ran with it. But it's way above our head. We were like, we can't really fix that. But one of the interesting things is, of course, the conference, looking at the Bitcoin, looking at blockchain, looking at what we're attempting to do, is I would say we talk about infrastructure and critical infrastructure. And when you look at what the blockchain or what the chain can do and what crypto can do is, the municipalities actually can write and request to harden their communities, meaning look at their chief resiliency officers or their state resiliency and look at it from, hey, we can do this. We can harden our networks, maybe not so that it's, from the SIPR net, if anybody knows about, the secret net and all the classification stuff, but you can make it more difficult. And what you want to do is they want to go after the easy targets. So if you make it more difficult by using technology that's readily available, then why not? And the infrastructure plan, that has been pushed by at the federal level, you can draw that funding down to you and use this type of technology to help your CIOs, which I know a lot, like here in Mount Pleasant, and as well as in the city of Charleston. When I met with them years back on Jack Voltaic from a critical infrastructure protection piece from a cyber perspective, it was one person, they're like, listen, I'm just trying to keep emails up. And I'm like, you know what, I hear you. And because when I come from the DoD, I expect to have like a floor of individuals. And then I realized this one person is running a municipality, and people like me have 10 trouble tickets a day. Like, that does impact actually the security of the municipality because they're not hardening their system. So we have to use technology to enable them to help us out and to become harder. So I think there are ways of doing it, looking at the various ways of getting with your local communities for the critical infrastructure protection, piece is definitely a good way to build the unique security infrastructure. I won't say cheap, but at a much lesser cost to be much more effective if you unify in that way than attempting to hire 15 people that are just going to have people like me say, oh, I have 20 now trouble tickets. And so, but yeah, they're definitely under.
I think use case is really important. And if we look at like different counties or municipalities, if we look at something as simple as permits, building permits, right? And houses could be in county one day and then the city expands and now it goes from county lines to city lines. If building permits are not retained by the county or by the city, but on the blockchain, when it goes over, if county goes, oh, it's no longer our property, we can discard those records. Somebody goes to buy a house 10 years later, goes to find out if their pool was permitted. City goes, I don't have record of it. It might have happened before we took control of that area. County goes, oh, we don't control that area anymore. We discarded it. But if it's on the blockchain, it's there forever. It's immutable. So what you give there is you add now consumer protection, you give accountability, and the advantages of utilizing distributed ledger technology actually goes far beyond. And the government's starting to see that. We saw that DISA came out with an RFI last year for implementing DLT technologies across all of government, which is really cool. Alfonso was talking about the Air Force. The Air Force AFWERX is probably the most innovative branch of government right now. And they're coming out with different requests for information and requests for proposals for implementing these technologies. So going back to what you were saying, one of the key things that we need to do as industry is to have a layer of education. And we have to be very careful with the slangs that we use because people hear blockchain and all of a sudden it's just Bitcoin. It's just this, it's crypto. Oh, you know what? It's consuming all of the energy of the world. Yeah. All that information is not really true. The problem is there's a stigmatism that's built around the name blockchain. And when we talk to local municipalities, if we use DLT or different terms, then they're much more open and receptive to looking at what we have to offer.
Right, they just don't put the goggles on, right? When everybody hears crypto, they're like, oh God, you either love it or you hate it, and then you stop listening, right? And so to their point is if we even just call it something slightly different to get people to stop throwing the Heisman up, that sort of gets the discussion happening. And again, having one of the programs, University of the Cumberlands, as one of the first folks to have academic programs is a start because we got to teach the people, we got to teach the young folks. We have a sort of like a effort going on in a small town that I'm working on now in Rich Spring, Moneta. We're going to try to bring a Bitcoin farm to that community to teach them how to do a lot of this stuff too. So that's one of the efforts we have is, right, you start small and you get bigger. What are your questions, guys, today, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, ma'am. Say again? Brian.
Sure, yeah, I think if you guys could talk a little bit, Clem, you had given me a story earlier about inbound capital expansion into environments where there is no formal title and registry, or that there can be conflicting reports on who owns what. So I think one of the most formative things for us at HUMBL when we were doing our DD before we launched the business and went public was discovering how much geographical and technological ingress was going on globally from folks like China, not just focusing on weapons or defense, but rather does defense come through the growth of technology and geographical expansion. If you look at like the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, China is actively building stadiums, schools, libraries, airports in places where land and title are not super formalized. So I was wondering if you could share your personal example, because it'll bring it home for folks that are not in blockchain, but also talk about how important blockchain can be to the United States in our defense efforts from a geographical expansion standpoint and a technological defense.
Absolutely, yeah. Part of my old previous defense life I try to forget about, but Brian brought it up. Understanding a lot about what's going on with China and not in competitors, global competitors, because they're not always adversaries, but they may not be in line with what we're thinking or whatever. So when we look at the competition out there, one of the things that we looked at is earlier this morning there was a panel where they talked about how South Carolina came to be, how it was it was like 8 provinces, and then after the Civil War, families were granted partials of land. But then it wasn't titleized. Well, under the King's Law, I was, I'm a fly fishing guide also, and I was going to guide out in the Bahamas, and Andros, a friend of mine, had built a lodge. Well, they also had the King's Law where that family, somebody had moved away. Like, he had bought it, he thought he had bought it. He built the lodge, he got everything functioning, we're getting ready to go out there, and this random person walks up and says, I have a right to this land because it was in my family and this, that, and the other. And the Bohemian government said, yep, okay, no argument, au revoir, you're done. Well, it's because, it's interesting because the same thing happened here in South Carolina. It's still ongoing, and they discussed that this morning. And how are we going to take documents and bring them together, codify them, legitimize them, somehow, because you can bring a bunch of information together. It doesn't mean that it's legitimate. Bring it together, look at it, and then codify it almost like a new type of DNA, so that there is a historical artifact that they can go back. And it's not that just a family that you can't buy something, it's something that you may not be able to sell it. Because if you don't have a title, you got to go through a bunch of processes, and you may not have the money to get a title lawyer and to do the research. So it works on both sides, for the buyer and the seller, depending upon how you look at it. But it's happening all over the place. And again, interesting thing what Brian said about China per se is, where they are doing this globally, they're going in and they build a dependency model. And the dependency model is they come in and they'll say, we're going to do this for your government, we're going to do this for for the cities and such, but they get into the permitting, they get into the government, and then what they do is they build a stadium, but it's operated by their people. And the Bohemians actually, I had a good relationship with them, they said that's why they turned it down, because it was for them. But there are other countries that aren't as fortunate to do that. So they have to take what they can get, and it's a level of influence which is very interesting, and how they do it. But that's gonna be like 5 hours going. But it is interesting. Like I think the most important piece is here in South Carolina,
Right.
where that information is. How do you bring that together, and then how do you capture that so it doesn't disappear, and that you have that artifact that families can latch on to and either retain it or move it into, possibly a sale.
Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
It was about hardware. So I know that with the Inflation Reduction Act that there's a lot of goals to bring like chip manufacturing, processor manufacturing back to the United States. As far as national security is concerned, should that be like on our radar?
So I'll take a stab at it first. So first of all, yes, absolutely, because transistors that are developed in country A, whatever, or any chips that are made in another country, if we don't have access to where it's at, we can't validate if it's counterfeit, real, or not, right? So as far as chips, we absolutely have to trust where they're coming from, because without going at an unclassified level, whenever you order hardware, it usually goes to different places, or it comes from different places. And so the NSA has a really ginormous look at their supply chain when it comes to what they buy for themselves. Other companies, not so much. So you can't trust where you got the devices or the hardware from. Interesting questions we had here is like the rigs that people are showing that they sell now, where are those parts coming from that go into those rigs, right? Now, I know all the folks here, they use American parts, or they have trusted parts, I hope, but that's important to understand what's going into your industry and stuff like that. So yeah. He said 0 minutes.
What's really cool, though, is for all of these concerns, while government does have to worry about where all components are sourced for, there's a very cool utility out there right now called the Blocks Registry that can help bring all this together. It's open source, open standard. Governments can adopt it. Local municipalities can adopt it. And it's all blockchain based, so it'll be there forever and very easy to use. But I do see a lot coming in play to standardize this in the future and the ability for blockchain to solve a lot of these issues.
Lastly, with what you said about the hardware, I know we're like at zero, but this is important, is, people talk about know your customers. Okay, well, because how customers have changed and it becomes a personal identity when you open a business, okay, it's know your business. And I've introduced these guys to some of the individuals I used to work with, that we have found that the US government went back 4 degrees of separation. We go back 8 to 10 degrees of separation. And we've started identifying funding sources that have gotten in, and one was the F-35 strike fighter piece. And again, we keep going back and back. And so, yes, it's coming up and we're talking, but sometimes the innocent have no idea. They're unwitting participants in somebody else's. And when that money chain goes down, they have to shut down. They can't keep operating. And that's a long strategic, that's a long look piece, but you're right, there are implications, and hardware is definitely one of them. So we're trying to bring back a lot of the battery foundries, the microchips, especially with the NEVI Act that came out. They're really looking at making more between here, Canada, and Mexico versus outsourcing across the pond.
Luke, is that our time, Luke? Okay, so last question. Anybody have a last question? We'd like to close it up and everybody start drinking. I'll buy the first round, whoever's ready. We're just going to keep it going. Thanks, everyone, for your time, and we'll stand by for any more questions.
Appreciate it. Thank you.